It does have some corporate office buildings, but for the most part, it's a residential town with rolling hills and beautiful landscapes. Until World War II, it was an agricultural community. In the 1950s, Wilton evolved into a residential suburb of New York, a particularly beautiful one. And it's a town's beauty that most residents still love.
It's obviously a place where people who commute to New York live, but they come out here and find a little peace, a little tranquility, a lot of beauty. It's very beautiful. It's full of trees. It's zoned for 2 acres so that the houses are separated but not isolated. There are a lot of community activities here, a lot of things for the children to do. It's a pretty little town. If you look.
But this little utopia, some residents say, has developed a flaw. Like many small Connecticut towns, Wilton's drinking water comes from drilled wells, and it's that water that has recently become the center of controversy. You see, some residents claim that it's become polluted by the town's sanitary landfill, now the transfer station site. The Mather Street Landfill was opened in 1967 to a great deal of opposition. It was people like Frederick Wood of Wampum Hill Road who said the proposed dump would cause serious injury to his family because of heavy truck traffic and damage to his property value. That's how the opposition started, but as time went on, another fear was added, that the landfill would cause serious health and environmental problems that residents might have to live with for the rest of their lives. To many in Wilton, that fear has come true. But how can something like this happen? The Mather Street Landfill, now a 400-foot-high mountain, was once part of a swamp in a residential area. And the important thing about that, opponents say, is that a swamp is not really the best place to put a landfill. Resident Ann Caggiano.
The landfill is situated on the top of a hill with a bowl or crater like something like St. Helens after it's erupted. The garbage or whatever that's put in there is on Adrian muck. Adrian muck is a constant running swamp. It's constantly resurging waters underneath. It's not as though a swamp would dry up part of the year during the dry periods. This is constantly wet. So aside from the water that percolates down through the top, carrying whatever down into the water, we have a constant surgence of water underneath all this. And this goes into the bedrock streams and the fissures of the bedrock, which eventually ends up in our wells. With their blasting that they did, they also disturbed the crevices on the bedrock, creating a quicker passage for all the stuff.
Dr. Ralph Goffstein of the Stanford Department of Health agrees that the use of a swamp area as a landfill is potentially dangerous.
And those of us in public health would not want to have a landfill that might conceivably contaminate a nearby well. We would just simply locate the landfill elsewhere at a sufficiently far distance and in sufficiently safe geological formations that would not cause problems. Blasting, for example, in rock formations does open up cracks and does cause problems like contaminated wells to turn up.
This story began on February 24th, 1965, when Wilton's Refuse Disposal Study Committee asked the Board of Selectmen to buy this land, 73-acre site on Mather Street, for use as a landfill. But opposition to the purchase proposal began immediately. So the late First Selectman Vincent Tito adjusted his proposal to say the land would be used as a landfill only in the case of an emergency. Days later, the town bought the property for $67,000. A year later, in Tito's view, that emergency happened. The dump in Weston, which Wilton had been using for 30 years, closed down after a rash of fires. That left Wilton with no dumping ground at all. Because of the predicament, Tito had an access road built to the Mather Street site even before he received an okay from the state to begin using it. While he waited for that approval, Tito received another $75,000 from the town to begin making the property into a landfill. The State Department did give the First Selectman its blessings. But then Tito ran into another obstacle. He was called into court to show why the town should use this property as a dump area. Eventually, the Superior Court judge prohibited the town from using this property as a dump. He said a landfill there would have a depreciating and depressing effect on real estate, and it would create fire and traffic hazards. And he said it would create the possibility of well water contamination in a town that had no city water supply, just wells. It looked like the landfill was defeated, But it wasn't. The western dump closed, and 4 days later, all refuse collection stopped in Wilton. The town health director, Dr. Henry Applebaum, declared a state of emergency and said the town must make immediate use of the Mather property for residential trash dumping. The Connecticut Supreme Court backed the director, but the State Department refused to get involved, so the landfill was open without the extensive studies that the Department of Environmental Protection uses today when it's considering looking for a site. That department was just getting started, and since then the standards have toughened. Health officials I talked to say that if the same site were proposed as a dumping ground today, it would not be allowed to open. And it seems for good reason, because after years of letters to the editor at the Wilton Bulletin and complaints to City Hall and to state officials, the state in 1974 ordered the landfill closed because of unsanitary conditions. This is the landfill that state and town officials say has been tested more than any other fill in the state. But it was the unsanitary conditions here that Ann Caggiano says poisoned her well and that of her neighbors. In fact, Caggiano claims that of 25 homes surrounding the landfill, at least 13 people have contracted cancer because the landfill polluted their well waters.
Coming south, there was 1 case of cancer here, 2 cases of cancer here. As we went down further, another case of cancer here. We turned the corner onto Honey Hill Road. There's a case of cancer here.
Caggiano is a Georgetown Wilton resident. She's also president of PEACE, People for Environmental Awareness, Conservation and Ecology. The organization grew out of the landfill protests and is made up of Georgetown, Wilton, and Cannondale residents. They claim the state and townspeople have dragged their feet in responding to complaints. They say their wells remain toxic. But Wilton officials here say they've tested the wells and they're not polluted. Let's take a closer look at both sides. The Peace Organization paid for extensive testing to be done on the landfill. Jan Dunn, an analyzer for the Connecticut Fund for the Environment, told News 12's Becky Saran that he's not sure what he has found.
We're really not sure of the cause and effect relationship between the leachate levels that we found in the landfill and these apparent, the water quality in these private wells surrounding the landfill. In some of the water samples, we detected elevated levels of metals and organics that I believe was a cause of concern. And my recommendations were that it should be monitored as closely as possible because of the proximity of the landfill site to private wells.
And Caggiano says the wells closest to the landfill were polluted.
1 private well came right up to the drinking water standard on mercury, another right up to the drinking water standard on cyanide, and phthalates. Phthalates are used in softening plastic. They are known to cause liver cancer in rats.
Caggiano says substances like benzene, toluene, and benzidine were found in the groundwater, and she says that could be because almost anything could have been dumped at the landfill.
It was said that if you were to pay the guy who ran the bulldozer, or you were to bring him some goodies or something, he'd bury whatever you wanted up there.
Caggiano says she will produce a town public works worker if she needs to in court. Stanford Health Director Ralph Goffstein says some of the things found at the landfill are toxic.
Can cause blood diseases, and so can toluene, and benzidine is a material used in intermediate making dyestuffs that is very potent, can cause bladder cancer among other things, but also other cancers.
The Department of Environmental Protection put any question of whether the wells could be contaminated to rest when they found one at 94 Mather Street with an elevated background chemistry or alkalinity. It was Senior Sanitary Engineer William Buckley that told the DEP that home was probably affected by leachate. Buckley was eventually taken off the case by his superiors who said they had a difference of opinion. The Dolairs, who also live on Mather Street, are now in pretrial hearings at Stanford Superior Court, where they're suing the town of Wilton for damages. The Dolairs live a quarter-mile southwest and downhill from the landfill on a sprawling 2-acre lot. Ula says his family used to swim in his father's pool, but now it's polluted.
We had this analyzed, and we found out that this contains about 11,000 parts per million of manganese. And the drinking water standard, I believe, is something like 0.05 parts per million.
What else is in the water? What else have you found in the water?
Well, we found chlorides, which are an excellent indicator of leachate, sodium. I'm talking about things that don't occur naturally. Because
They say they're taking the town to court because the town has overlooked their problem.
the town was not dealing with the problem in what we thought was a responsive way. In fact, they didn't do anything. They stonewalled it. They didn't answer our letters and didn't answer our requests for improving the situation.
But First Selectman Margaret Gill says there's no conclusive evidence of poisoning.
The water is considered potable up to this point. We will continue to monitor it, and if at some point it's considered not potable, then we will provide the water.
Is there something that you would like the town to do?
Very much like to take it away, take the whole thing away.
Do you feel it's harming the environment?
Of course it does, very much so, in the highest degree. It was a beautiful, I remember when they put the garbage on top of the groundwater. It was transparent, beautiful green water.
The water was much different and the land was much different 41 years ago when you moved here?
Well, I can see the trees are dying. Where the stream comes down from the landfill, they are dying off.
Lee Anayim lives near the Mather Street landfill, and he says he doesn't take any chances.
We have a 16-month-old daughter and a year-and-a-half-old daughter, and we don't want to find out years down the road that they're going to wind up having cancer because of things that have been dumped up at the dump site up on the hill.
The landfill neighbors have been fighting to get the town to deliver bottled water to their doorstep because they say their well water is polluted. But the town has refused to deliver the water. Public Works Director Thomas Thurkettle says the wells are being monitored and nothing has been found.
To the best of my knowledge, they have found nothing that is, harmful to the drinking water to date.
But in July, the town's consultants released their latest findings, and they're not as optimistic. The report says that polluted water seepage has been detected and that it's moving to the west and south of the landfill. The well at this house, 94 Mather Street, has been pinpointed in the past as a problem well. The new findings also show that it has been, quote, impacted to a small degree by the landfill leachate, which migrated down through a fractured bedrock system under the landfill. That's no revelation to Ann Caggiano, who has led the landfill opposition. She says the water pollution is coming through the bedrock and runoff from the top of the landfill. She says the town should at the very least cap the landfill with a clay cover to help contain the pollution. And the state has in fact ordered the town to do so. But First Selectman Margaret Gill says that's too expensive.
That becomes a very expensive operation because the clay that would be involved is found in England. The landfill is the garbage that is buried in an area where it has a lot of springs. And so it's questionable whether we really would do anything to cap the landfill because the water's coming from underneath, too.
But Caggiano's point is that if the underground spring pollution can't be stopped, that's bad enough. It shouldn't be made worse by allowing surface runoff to contribute to the problem. But how real is the problem? State Department of Toxic Hazards has done an epidemiological study of the area, and they say there's no strong evidence that the cancer in the area was caused by water pollution. The state study looked at the individuals in the neighborhood, their habits and occupations. I did some of my own research. After checking with several tumor registries and talking to relatives and checking out death certificates, I also found 10 names of people who have cancer or who have died from it. One of them, the state says, was not on their list. Here are the 10 we found. But how significant is this group of cancer cases? The answer isn't clear because the cancer was in different parts of the body. And state investigators told me the cancer cluster could very well be just coincidence. But Caggiano says she finds that hard to swallow.
That if you take known carcinogens, which we found in the drinking water and in the landfill, and you put them into a potpourri, a mixture, causing a mixture of contaminants in the water, you're going to get that same potpourri in the effects. Our director of health says, we'll wait until there's an epidemic of leukemia or an epidemic of liver cancer. You can't do that. You've got to handle the situation now because you can't wait for an epidemic. It's going to be too late. It's too late now.
And when did the outbreaks of cancer begin?
I would say they started from 7 to 10 years after the landfill opened, and they've been coming up ever since. 9 of the people are dead. There's only 4 of us left to talk.
Some investigators said one reason there may be a high cancer death rate is because the older age of some of the victims. Dr. Ralph Goffstein says that makes sense, but there's another side of the coin.
Well, the elderly and the very young are generally at the most risk with any kind of insult. And I would say that, you know, at the both ends of the lifespan, so to speak.
Is there conclusive evidence either way? Jan Dunn, water analyzer, says no, but he says that's the nature of the science.
There's a lot of uncertainty in the science regarding environmental carcinogenesis. And that's why, you know, the citizens were concerned. That's why I was concerned.
But Caggiano says she was sure the landfill should have never opened in 1968, and she turned out to be right. And she says this time she doesn't want to take a chance and wait to see if she's right again.
Out of 25 homes, 110 people, we've got 25 or 30 kids under 21. I don't want them 10 years from now to have to say that we were right. Now they're saying we were right in '64. I don't want them to have to say again, you know, in '94, we were right, something should have been done.